Hello, you're listening to the Diplomat's Asia Geopolitics podcast. I'm your host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Ankit Panda, also in Washington, D.C. Good to join you, Katie.
How are you doing?
Doing good. It's a beautiful fall week here in Washington.
Sort of. It's been a bit cold, but let's turn our attention to something that is heating up. It strikes me that it's been a while since we have talked about the South China Sea on this podcast, but it's certainly one of the granddaddy geopolitical issues in the region, and in recent weeks has certainly heated up, though that is maybe an underestimation. But let's just get into it, Ankit. What has been happening in the South China Sea in the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months, that sort of prompts us to revisit it now?
Yeah, so this is going to be familiar to, I think, longtime listeners of the Asia Geopolitics podcast. We're almost coming up on 10 years of this podcast, and inevitably we find our way back to the South China Sea when tensions flare up. So the broader context here goes back to, I think, August, when the China Coast Guard, Chinese maritime law enforcement vessels, along with China's maritime militia, the so-called array of allegedly non-state vessels that basically serve the ends of Chinese national interests in the South China Sea, began harassing the Philippines Coast Guard and Filipino fishermen around Second Thomas Shoal, which is a submerged reef in the disputed Spratly Islands. Now, Second Thomas Shoal, while it is disputed, while sovereignty is disputed, I should note here that the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling on the South China Sea disputes that was filed by the Philippines basically determined that China's maritime claims to the waters around Second Thomas Shoal were illegitimate, right? That ruling did not take any decision on sovereignty matters. That was not the ambit of that ruling, but it did concern maritime entitlements. And so, as some listeners might know, Second Thomas Shoal is particularly notable as the site of the permanently positioned Filipino naval vessel Sierra Madre, which is famously marooned at Second Thomas Shoal. It ran aground deliberately. It is a commissioned vessel in the Philippines Navy. And so this has been a long-running source of tension between China and the Philippines, whereas China tries to prevent the Philippines from basically providing, resupplying the vessel where Filipino armed forces are permanently based as a means of asserting sovereignty to this feature. So that's kind of the background here. The reason we're having this conversation now, Katie, is that things really did spike in the final couple weeks in October. Notably, the Chinese Coast Guard rammed a Philippine supply vessel near Second Thomas Shoal. This was against the backdrop of other incidents in the South China Sea, not directly related to this, but, there were Chinese aircraft that on October 29th fired flares in front of a Canadian military helicopter. There was a flyby within 10 feet of an American B-52 bomber in the South China Sea as well. So all of this, I think, points to a general flare-up. There's been some commentary that, maybe China's doing this because the United States is simply stretched a little bit too thin right now with crises in the Middle East and Ukraine, etc. I don't think that's necessarily well supported, given that these tensions have been simmering since August. So I think there's a lot to talk about here, the risks of escalation, what the United States has done, but it's certainly, I think, one of the more notable crisis flare-ups in the South China Sea that we've seen in a while.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about a recent visit by the Japanese Prime Minister to the Philippines, which sort of, I think, is an interesting event. Obviously, these countries have a bilateral relationship, and both of these countries are U.S. allies. But it's interesting to watch the defense relationship between the two of them sort of progress. We ran an article today in which one of our Japanese authors pointed out that two Japanese papers sort of said that Japan and the Philippines are aiming to upgrade their relationship to a, quote, quasi-alliance. Now, this is what the papers said, not necessarily what anybody officially said, but they have started negotiations on a reciprocal access agreement. Maybe the simplest version of this question is Beijing kind of shooting itself in the foot with these incidents and kind of pushing other countries in the region, some with claims to the South China Sea and some just sort of neighboring states like Japan? Is it sort of pushing them together in a way that is honestly beneficial to the American alliance network and sort of detrimental to China and its claims?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of that. I would also point, of course, to Philippines. It's domestic politics in the Philippines, right? The fact that we've gone from Rodrigo Duterte now to Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has led to a substantial change in how Manila approaches the South China Sea disputes, how Manila approaches the alliance with the United States, where we've seen the expanded Enhanced Defense Cooperation Act with the United States, which was agreed in 2014 by the Obama administration, become a lot more realistic in its implementation and sort of surge. And I think that also explains part of the story here with the Philippines' relations with Japan. Now, for Tokyo, I think there's a clear logic to this, which is allowing bolstering the Philippines' capabilities, maritime domain awareness, its own ability to maintain sovereignty, benefits the so-called rules-based order that Tokyo supports in the region. Right, Japan has been a stalwart supporter of the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling, sees international law in particular as an important tool in the South China Sea disputes, and I think that's sort of coloring the broader logic here. But you're absolutely right that this is welcome news for Washington, which has been trying to more broadly network its alliances in the region. And so while this isn't going to lead to a trilateral sort of Philippines, Japan, U.S. alliance or anything like that, I think the United States certainly welcomes these new arrangements between its allies. So Japan and the Philippines getting closer together, agreeing a reciprocal access agreement, that is certainly not something that the United States will be upset about at all. I think it's very welcome.
Let's go back to the Philippines domestic politics, because that was another question I thought we should give some attention to. Is, how much of what's currently happening do you think is rooted in that change between Duterte and Marcos, or is this is it not related to that domestic change? Duterte was not interested in sort of enforcing the arbitral decision in 2016, which I think that had been filed by the previous administration and then was determined early in his administration. And then, we have Marcos now. What are those dynamics like?
Yeah, so, Aquino, the predecessor to Duterte, was very assertive on Philippine maritime claims in the South China Sea, including by filing the arbitral tribunal ruling. Duterte, by contrast, was quite anti-American on a personal level. And there's an interesting tension here because the Philippines is one of the most pro-American countries in the entire world when it comes to public opinion. And arguably, the Philippines Armed Forces, many of the bureaucrats in the Philippines national bureaucracy are also quite pro-American, so they support the alliance. But when you have a president at the top that's openly resentful in many ways of the United States, that creates some tensions that we certainly saw influencing the alliance in the Duterte years, right? The alliance almost came to a rupture before the United States, under the Biden administration, sort of stepped in and restored things. And now the U.S.-Philippine alliance is in a very different place. So domestic politics matters, but also, this is a hot-button kind of populist issue in the Philippines, Chinese sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. So every time there is a flare-up like this, I think it does generate a surge of support for Philippines-U.S. For the alliance more broadly. And it's also notable here that the United States has been pretty open in its support for the Philippines in the face of what the State Department called PRC harassment in the South China Sea. There was a statement issued by the State Department on October 22nd, the same day that a Philippines supply vessel was rammed, noting that the United States affirmed that Article 4 of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty extended to armed attacks on Philippine Armed Forces public vessels, importantly, right? There's the Sierra Madre, still a commissioned vessel in the Philippines Navy, anywhere in the South China Sea, implying that if China were to attack the Sierra Madre or take steps beyond what it had already done, that might activate the alliance with the United States. So it's a clear deterrence message. But also in that same statement, the U.S. was careful in, I think, the language it chose, because it noted that the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia, quote, violated international law by intentionally interfering with the Philippine vessel's exercise of high seas freedom of navigation. Now, interference with freedom of navigation, while not great, is not an armed attack, right? So there's a notable difference there. The U.S. was, I think, drawing something of a red line, you might say, in terms of what actions would actually trigger American red lines in the alliance.
And maybe we should talk about that next then, how easily can sort of these incidents, sort of the water cannons, the near misses, these little bumps at sea, how easily can these incidents really escalate into either open conflict or something sort of a step in that direction? Does it come down to the incident itself or sort of the decisions on each side as to what happens?
So, there's already been Philippine casualties. A few Philippine fishermen were actually killed by a collision with a maritime militia vessel. And so the potential for escalation, I think, is quite real, especially when you might have some of these maritime militia vessels potentially not respecting whatever rules of engagement might be there on the Chinese side, which might be better applied to the maritime law enforcement vessels. Fortunately, nothing like that has happened yet, where we haven't seen a direct armed attack in the sense that the alliance would be triggered and we would potentially have a very serious crisis on our hands. But the potential is very much there. I think something else I want to note, though, Katie, it's been interesting to sort of observe all of this action in the South China Sea at the same time when we're starting to see a lot of positive signals in the U.S.-China official relationship, right? I mean, we're having this conversation on November 3rd, Friday, and on Monday, the U.S. and China are about to have an official meeting in Washington on arms control, for instance. And at the Shangshan Forum recently in China, senior PLA officials indicated that they were open to military crisis management talks with the United States, which had been suspended deliberately since former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. So there's sort of two tracks of kind of trends happening here. You have stepped up tensions in the South China Sea, unsafe aerial encounters, harassment of Philippines vessels, at the same time that we're beginning to see something of a diplomatic rapprochement. And the broader context here is the anticipated meeting between President Biden and President Xi at the APEC summit coming up in just a couple weeks. So that, I think, raises the question about whether some of these dynamics are due to dynamics at the local level. Is the PLA Southern Theater Command, for instance, carrying out what it believes to be a broader mandate of kind of projecting Chinese power, defending Chinese claims that's somewhat detached from the broader diplomatic rapprochement? I just don't think we know, but I think it's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because those are two sort of somewhat conflicting trends. But I think in a larger mindset, when you have a crisis, then that is a good time to have crisis mechanisms that you work on. So maybe it provides the excuse to work on these things in a way. But we shall see what happens Monday, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. Do you have anything else to add before we let our listeners go for the day?
Not really. I mean, I think this is something we're definitely going to keep our eye on. I'll be very curious to see how the messaging that the United States has already publicly engaged in around the particular harassment of the Philippines manifests during the Biden-Xi meeting, if at all. It would be very interesting if we see Biden issue a direct message to Xi Jinping on so-called red lines in the South China Sea when it comes to defending the interests of American allies and supporting freedom of navigation. The return of sort of track 1 talks, I think is really important, right? This meeting that's about to take place on Monday is the first meeting of its kind since the Obama administration. So it's really, I think, an interesting turn. Yeah, it has been a while. And so I think we're going to see potentially more data points on just how salient the South China Sea continues to be in the U.S.-China relationship, right? This used to be, of course, the hot issue towards the second half of the second term of the Obama administration, and then kind of the South China Sea remained important, but got sort of drowned out by the trade war and broader U.S.-China tensions under the Trump administration. So now that we have this serious surge of action around Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal, in the Spratlys, I'll be curious to see if we see more indicators that the South China Sea is rising in salience once again.
Well, we will certainly keep our eyes on this issue and the China-U.S. relationship. That's all for today to our listeners. As always, please like and review our podcast wherever it is that you listen to it. Recommend it to your friends, and please don't hesitate to get in touch with Ankit or myself. We love taking your suggestions. And I guess have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Katie. Good chatting with you as always.